Now, we're returning this morning to a story we know lots of parents in Surrey are struggling with: the NHS waiting times for children with mental health problems. What's been done about it? Why is it still happening? The NHS Trust that runs mental health services in Surrey is speaking to us after 8 o'clock this morning.
But first, we're going to hear from a Surrey parent whose 8-year-old son has been waiting nearly a year for help after writing a suicide note. In the meantime, she's been getting support from a charity, the Sunflower Trust. I sat down with her to find out more.
I think we were on about our third exclusion and he was just getting more miserable. I was getting more stressed, and I got to the point where I just thought, God, this is completely beyond me as a parent, completely beyond me. I have one child. I've never done this before. I'm a single parent, so I'm on my own with it as well. And I was just at a bit of a loss, and it got to the point where he got excluded, and he was so distressed about the whole thing that he effectively started talking about killing himself. And then he wrote me a note, a very distressing note about killing himself. And it was at that point I flagged it back to school. We were back at CAMS again. And at that point, we did see a psychologist. But for about 45 minutes of that hour we were with them, they talked to me about the background, really, and I felt that was perhaps a bit of a wasted opportunity. Then my son was called back in to speak to the psychologist, and she spent about 5-10 minutes with him and went straight into asking him about this suicide note, at which point he went and hid under a chair. And the upshot of that meeting was art therapy was recommended, but they said their waiting list was about 12 months. Now, I've got absolute respect for the NHS and everything they do, and I think we're very, very lucky in this country. We have access to so much free medical care, but I did feel a little bit let down in terms of support for him. I'd been able to get quite a bit of support for myself with counselling and mental health support for the anxiety that I was experiencing around some things that had been happening with us. But there seemed to be not very much there for him. And as a child, I felt that was sort of wrong. Surely these are the people that need this support the most, because they can't handle what's going on for them. They don't understand, differences in the way they think about things and emotions and all that sort of thing. So it was at that point, just very, very luckily, through a conversation with a parenting coach locally who runs a separated mums group. She's been doing some work with the Sunflower Trust, and she sort of put me in touch with them, and that started our conversations with them as to what perhaps they could do to help us.
So how have they helped?
Well, we're still on the waiting list for CAMS. We're actually coming up a year on that now, so it'll be interesting to see what does come out of that. But my son has been seeing one of their practitioners over near Farnham, and she's just been amazing. So we've been seeing them monthly since I think about March this year, March or April. So the first thing that they start with is looking at my son's skeletal alignment. So osteopathy is the basis of the treatment, and they identified that he was hugely out of alignment.
As a parent, I can't imagine how difficult this whole period has been for you. I mean, having a child that's written a suicide note, for you, it must have just been unthinkable.
Yeah, that was a pretty low day dealing with that. Yeah, really upsetting. And I think for me, the worst thing was always that he was getting labelled. And children are not kind at that age. It got to a point where he was being seen as different. He was being seen as difficult. And you sort of, you track ahead in your mind and start to think, God, where is this going to end up? Especially with the suicide statistics for young men. That was really just on my mind as where does this end up? If something isn't done to support this child now, is he going to be one of those terrible statistics in his 20s? God forbid. So yeah, really scary. And as I said earlier, I just felt that it was completely beyond me. When you have a child, you think about the practical things you're going to do to care for that child, and you're going to imagine yourself reading to them at night and, putting them to bed and, taking them to the park. And I know this is the same for many parents. You just have no clue and concept about the things that you are going to end up having to do with them. And then seems to be an even further step, to the extreme in terms of having to deal with something really difficult without feeling equipped at all. So finding, a charity like the Sunflower Trust that's what they do. That is what they are there to do. They are there to support children having all sorts of difficulties, whether that's children that are statemented or whether that's just kids having a hard time of some sort.
Well, let's speak now to Surrey McGregor, practitioner at the Sunflower Trust. Morning to you. Can you explain exactly what the Trust does?
Hi, good morning. Well, when a child first comes to see a practitioner within Sunflower, we do an assessment, and that assessment is quite comprehensive. It takes about an hour, and we do a physical assessment, which looks at the alignment and the posture of the musculoskeletal system. We look at neurological integration, we look at emotional, we look at a whole range of things, so that before we actually start a treatment, we then have a really good understanding of how that child is integrated within their system, with all the different systems. And then we actually create an individual program for them, which we take them through according to how they are reacting and according to where they are in terms of neurological and musculoskeletal integration.
Talk me through the osteopathy and the person's alignment that we just heard the mum talking about there.
Well, the musculoskeletal system is a hugely interesting system. I mean, I've worked in this field for 28 years, and basically what we are finding is that every child that comes to see us, 99% of those children have a musculoskeletal misalignment.
What's that mean in English?
So, exactly. So what we're looking at is the shoulder girdle, the spine, the pelvis, how the child is standing. We're looking at how the head is sitting on the neck, and quite often we'll find that the pelvis might be out of alignment, so that although they appear to be standing straight, when you look more closely, actually their structure is quite asymmetrical. And once you have an asymmetrical structure, the neurological system, which then sends messages from the muscles to the central nervous system, to the brain, has to constantly be adapting and compensating for that change that has occurred. And this is hugely common in, all the population, but it's very interesting how common it is within children.
And so has that been proven, or is that something that you sort of are just practicing because everyone thinks it might be something?
Well, if you look at statistics, 84% of people of the population will have low back pain at some point in their life. So that's a really high figure. So in terms of finding this in children, there is no reason why children are not going to have any more musculoskeletal misalignments than an adult would. And basically, because their bodies are growing, and there's lots of changes happening in a very short space of time, and lots of children come and they complain of the so-called growing pains because the bones grow quicker than the muscles can adapt to, there are, in effect, more ways in which that system can have misalignment than maybe adults, because it's a constantly changing, adapting process.
Fascinating. And so that's just one area. What other conditions can you actually help with?
We don't necessarily put a big list of conditions out, say, yes, we can do this, this, and this. What we are interested in is the actual individual. It just so happens that when children come to us, they may have been diagnosed, for example, with dyslexia or dyspraxia, or, say, for example, ADHD, so this attention deficit disorder. There could be all manner of things. But basically, parents are bringing children because they are worried about the progression of how their child is doing. Now, that can have a huge knock-on effect to the academic performance, because once you are misaligned and you are lacking confidence, or you are having poor concentration because when your muscles are misaligned, it's more difficult for you to concentrate on things and focus, because then your system becomes very fidgety. And you have the typical child in the class who is fidgeting all over the place because it's due to a misalignment in the musculoskeletal system. So it's going to affect every aspect of their whole being. That being the case, this is where, and it can lead on to other more serious conditions, They usually come because the parent can see that the way their child is acting and the way they are growing up is not what they would want. And so we don't necessarily say, yes, you have to have this condition. We will treat any child whose mother has a concern about their performance and their development.
Surrey, thank you, practitioner at the Sunflower Trust. We're joined now by Dr. Phil Ferreira-Lay from Surrey and Borders NHS Trust. Morning. How long should somebody wait to see somebody?
Ideally, days and definitely not weeks, and that's always our aim. But I think one of the challenges that your family highlighted is that in Surrey, in common with other areas around the country, the demand upon services is meaning that people are either having to wait long times for assessments or also having to wait long times for treatment. But our endeavour is always, if we're able to make waits as minimal as possible.
What's the Trust doing to address those long waiting lists?
So the Trust was really conscious that we want to have a safe, sustainable service. And before the summer, we raised with our commissioners and with bodies such as CQC and NHSI the fact that we wanted to put this on a secure footing because we were hearing and our staff were experiencing stories similar to the one that you've highlighted. So an independent review was commissioned which has found that demand for our service is anywhere between 50 and 100% above what we could safely manage in terms of staffing and resources to meet that demand. So the findings have led us as a system, so ourselves, education colleagues and social care colleagues, to redouble efforts to try and make sure that we've got as much early help intervention in place so that we don't allow treatment times to increase and actually minimise those alongside keeping the downward pressure on assessment times.
But how can you meet that demand with people who are already waiting? Well, you said days should be there ideally, and it's weeks, and then we're hearing nearly a year. Something's got to change, isn't it?
It does. I think we're in a very awkward situation where healthcare funding is challenging across the whole country, and then linked with that, demand is increasing. But actually also the third bit, which makes things really tricky, is even if you've got the resources, and that's one thing we're focusing on, it's actually having enough staff to be able to see people quickly as well. So we're pulling out all the stops as a system. The specifics of that are being worked on. But one of the things we learned over the summer is, and that we're continuing with, is something called clinical advice and guidance, whereby teachers, families and GPs can have access to somebody like me on a daily basis as a first step in providing advice and guidance and signposting to that wider system offer.
The independent review said that projected demand by commissioners and the provider was low. Why was that, and why is the service being sort of almost caught by surprise by this?
I would challenge that, because I think we have been flagging up that we were receiving 12,000 referrals, whereas we're only commissioned to receive 6,500. I think what took the system by surprise was the fact that despite those challenges, we were able to see and continue to be able to see people in urgent or crisis situations. But of course what we don't want is for anybody to end up being in a crisis and urgent scenario. So it's how we compete and how we get at the right balance between the resourcing, the demand and the ability of us as a provider, as part of a wider partnership, to do as much as we can as early as we can. But I completely agree, it is challenging.
So have you got enough money and staff yet so the service can be delivered safely, as you put it?
No, I think the system doesn't have enough money to meet that demand, and the staffing, whether it's from us or from education or from social care, I think are challenged as caseloads continue to remain high. And that's the high-level challenging conversations we're having, because we want to continue to deliver the best service possible, but we want it to be sustainable so that we don't get into these cycles of effectively boom or bust around how we meet demand.
Charities like the Sunflower Trust that we heard about earlier on, will they be left to help more and more people and almost pick up what the NHS can't?
I think there is always a role for for voluntary and third sector partners. I mean, just to be clear, within our CAMS offer, we do provide interventions from charities that are linked with us. For example, Bernardo's, the National Autistic Society. But I just think the pressure is on for us to continue to be ever smarter in the way that we work and make use of the full range of resources that are out there. And if families are able to access helpful intervention that sits outside our service, that's great. We will want to work with them as best we can.
And a summit was held on September 13th to address it all. What happened at that meeting? What are the next steps? Because clearly you've got a huge mountain to climb here.
Yeah, so we had that summit that flagged up all the work that we did over the summer to see the 1,700 young people that were on our waiting list for assessment, and what I and others have been now taking the conversation forward to is how are we going to keep levels of waiting time for assessment low, whilst also now making sure that we reduce the time to wait for treatment, as your case study exemplified. So all the senior leaders in health, education and social care have committed to fulfilling or acting on the recommendations. What we're doing, for example, this afternoon is having a workshop within my service to actually see what that provision from a health perspective should look like, and then what we would want to do is share that with social care and education colleagues and see what they can do as part of that concerted effort going forward.
What's troubling is I'm guessing that we've heard one case study there, but there must be other patients that are waiting to be seen. And what does it mean for youngsters contemplating suicide?
I think it's scary. It's World Mental Health Day in a couple of days' time. Mental illness is the single cause of illness now across the world, and one of the reasons that I work with children is that I want to make sure that we don't turn young people who are struggling with emotional health and well-being issues into adults with emotional health and well-being issues. So suicide prevention is rightly top of many people's agendas. It's how we practically meet that demand that continues to be challenging, but something we'll continue facing.
The Prime Minister last week said austerity is over. Did you rejoice at that news?
I'm always the sort of person that wants to see words matched by action. I think the evidence on the ground suggests that families are continuing to struggle, and how we meet that struggle requires ongoing concerted effort and does require staff that can meet that need and resourcing that can pay for that need to be delivered.
Can you just give me one little bit of light at the end of the tunnel for just the woman you just heard that clip of? Because she's been waiting a year. She's probably listened to this and thought, well, nothing's going to change.
I go around the country comparing and seeing how our services compare to others. All services are challenged, but the reason that I stay in Surrey trying to help lead a leadership team and a staff group to work with young people in the way we do is because I think we are a committed sort of workforce, and actually I live in Surrey. I've got two young boys, a 7 and a 9-year-old, and if they ever had emotional health and well-being issues, I would want to feel as secure as possible that everybody is trying to do the best they can. We're committed. We are always sad when we hear cases like this, but we're going to keep on trying to do the best we can with partners, and that's the key bit. It's not just us, it's schools and education, to do the best we can.
Good to talk to you. Thanks for coming in, Dr. Phil Ferreira-Lay from Surrey Borders NHS Trust.